feel like it should be
the
like
audio's-
up here
yeah,
only.
interesting.
That's better.
Worst view in the house.
There it is.
Yeah, next time I know what I need for you guys. I got all the cable. I got everything in the back. So
That looks
there we
better.
go. That's better.
Pink lighting.
We'll check our YouTube on here.
Should we do pink or should we have a different color?
What is it? Purple?
Purple.
It doesn't look aggressive. We got a purple color, maybe.
What about red?
So I
Blue.
just-
What about blue?
white lights? I mean, but
What do you think? What looks better?
go back to that. I think if you minimize the window, you can do that.
So where's that?
Like
We should
go
get
up to the
muscle
top and minimize
suits.
this.
We should
That should be right now.
wear
Yeah.
prosthetic muscle suits and
What
get
is
like
more blue?
incrementally bigger ones without ever mentioning
Yeah,
it
try that.
until we're like fat suits, like till we like
Oh yeah. Okay.
yeah.
A little more like purpley blue, maybe.
It looks weird. The
Kinda
purple
makes Josh
looks
look sick.
the purple makes it feel like a local TV show.
Yeah.
Like
Channel 5 News.
yeah, it doesn't have that podcast vibe.
Need to be like soothing. But you're getting down to business.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, you can really go crazy with the micro adjustments on
I'm
there.
trying not to make Josh look like he's sick.
It'd be cool.
What about yellow?
Very, very careful.
Do you have jaundice?
There's not too much yellow.
Too much yellow. What about orange?
I'm like 1/32 Cherokee.
It's 12.
More Italian than I am Cherokee. Actually, I have no idea. That's a good question.
We've been live for 2 minutes.
Oh, we are live?
Yep.
Oh shit. No one's here. All right.
All right. I have the YouTube up on my phone. There are 3 people watching on YouTube right now.
Okay, so we should start.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
You want an intro?
Welcome to our second First Friday? Second or third First Free
Third.
Friday? This is third
Third,
First Free
yeah.
Friday. Today we're going to go over a little discussion probably on, I think, talking about maybe how to have a successful meet.
Yeah.
What we've seen from our own experience, watching people at international meets, at national level meets, even down to local meets, what we've done ourselves personally as coaches. Yeah, maybe even just some like anecdotal stuff too, things we've learned just from having been in it. So very excited to talk about that today. I'm Max Ada, obviously your favorite weightlifting coach. And then this is Josh. So anyways, no. That's Josh Gibson. I don't know what we call you now. What is your official title? Number 2. This is Josh Gibson. He's
Gotcha.
number 2.
Yeah.
No, Josh Gibson, sports scientist, almost a PhD, fantastic coach in his own right. He's going to be here to corroborate any of the information I give you, make
Right.
sure it's all factual and correct.
Yeah.
And then, share his opinions and his thoughts.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a great conversation given that you just traveled to Europeans and experienced a lot of
Yeah.
competing, right?
It's true.
And you watched many competitors from kind of the lowest tier international lifter to the best of the best. And you saw a lot of red and a lot of green. So a lot of
Yeah.
good lifts, a lot of bad lifts. What were some common themes you noticed? I mean, obviously it's complicated because there's the Olympic qualifier, so that changes the way they approach it.
Yeah. So if you look at success at international meets, a lot of it is kind of dependent on it's dependent on what country you're from and what country the refs are from.
Right.
No, it's dependent largely on, your competition. So you have at the international level, everyone is fighting for spots. They're all fighting for a placing. Versus you go to like a local level meet or maybe an AO series, and there's more people there. I mean, technically everyone's fighting for a placing, but there's more people there just trying to make lifts.
Yeah.
So attempt selection is different. At the top level, people are battling it out way more for placing.
Yeah.
The thing we saw at Europeans, and we've seen it this whole quad that's different, is you have people basically fighting for numbers that they need that are not relevant to the competition.
Right.
So you end up in a place where, you're going to try and do some kind of total that's going to get you on the list. And so you just see a lot of bomb outs and a lot of missed lifts because of that, because people are stretching as far as they can to get these totals that are not necessarily the right attempts to take if you want to win. The best example of this, I would say, was like, I want to say the 109 men's session. There was like 2 different groups in that session. The first group that started, tons of missed lifts, almost, maybe 2 or 3 bomb outs, and it was really rough. The second half of that session, where they were fighting for medals, lots of made lifts and very conservative attempts. We saw Christoph take like 5 lifts in a row that were really close to each other, and they all looked really within his abilities. Dadish Bailey's did lifts that were like definitely not maximum lifts. And so that was like a very like, competitive sort of session where people were fighting for lifts to make a medal. Whereas 59A session for the women was like a bloodbath. And it was like Nina Sturks, like missing lifts left and right and trying to make totals. And so it's just a different total, like a totally different perspective when you look at the international level currently, because the situation is such that everybody is trying to either get on the top 10 list or, they're so far ahead that they're maybe not even taking lifts that are important, or they're not even competing. So it's a weird mixed bag because of that.
Yeah, that's kind of the point I wanted to make, is that competition's embedded within a quad.
Yeah.
And within a qualification period, and within a higher stake situation. Whereas, say, at the American Open Series, where it's 1,000+ people of varying skill levels with really nothing on the line except they want to make a PR. I think approaching that competition is quite a bit different. Knowing that most of the people who are in weightlifting aren't competing at a very, very high level where it's medals first, or it's placings to make a certain team, or a placing to do something that's going to keep you in the sport of weightlifting. What can you glean from Europeans that we can kind of take to more local, regional, and national meets?
I don't even know if you can really pull a lot from the international level to like a local level meet. I think it gets confusing because I think, if you start from the beginning, like as a coach, what I want to see an athlete do at the lowest level, like maybe their first local meet, is be successful.
Right.
Because each meet that you have a good experience at just propagates another couple of months in the sport. And you know what I mean? Like what you're trying to do is get someone initially to like love the sport and buy in. And so you optimize for having good experiences, right? First local meet should be something where you're doing well. The make lifts, maybe you take shots at PRs, but it doesn't even matter. It's just a matter of like, did you enjoy the experience? Did you get something out of it? And then the next meet, you try to build on that. When you look at like the Europeans and like what is happening at the highest level, it can sometimes give you this perspective that like behaving a certain way at a meet, like, oh, take a PR attempt on your second or whatever, or like you always go for broke on your third or something. That becomes like a rule that people try to adopt at the lower level. And what happens is it becomes like a toxic's the wrong word, but just becomes a really like negative experience.
Yeah.
You don't want to have athletes. Like if you look, there's clubs all over the country, all over the world where it's the same kind of routine. It's like make or miss an opener, take a giant attempt on second, miss it, and then, nothing even close on the third. Or, a lot of 2 for 6s, or a lot of bomb outs, or a lot of like 1 for 6s, where you're just like throwing these huge lifts into the mix that are just unjustified.
Yeah.
And ultimately it's like your whole career you could have as an athlete could be just, populated with like 1 for 6 performances or 2 for 6 performances. And so looking at the high level weightlifting, like Europeans, worlds, and trying to extract like, what are they doing? I'm going to do the same thing at AO1 at, Columbus, Ohio.
Yeah.
Like that's just I think it's a mistake. I think you end up in a place where you're the best of the best that have very distinct goals that are outside the realm of what somebody at the lower level should be doing.
Yeah, and I think at the highest level, you almost, especially with the qualification procedure, you need an inflexible mindset of I need to make these lifts. I mean, if you don't hit the total, you can't qualify. So like by definition, you have to put a weight on the bar that's going to get you into the slot that's going to qualify for the Olympics. At a local meet or a national meet, you have to have a very flexible mindset of, I'm going to go in and hope for whatever we anticipate we can put on the bar.
Yeah.
But when that does or doesn't happen, we can pivot and make the right decisions to have a successful meet. And I think what you generally see is people who are inflexible, and maybe they miss 2 lifts, and then on their third they want to go up, right? Because it's like, well, I really wanted to hit this number. I really wanted to hit a PR. That like inflexibility really pigeonholes you into having generally very poor performances.
Yeah.
And it's tough to watch. And then also like in a competitive mindset or situation where, I mean, people are trying to basically force you into missing lifts. It's not
Yeah,
helpful, right?
Yeah.
So generally, from your experience, your decades of experience in weightlifting and coaching at a variety of meets at all different skill levels, what are some of the characteristics of successful competitors and successful competitions?
I mean, you have to take weights you can make. That's like the most primary thing. And like selecting those weights is obviously, based on information, based on skill, based on data as a coach. But, it's like the more somebody is under the assumption or believes that they're going to be successful, the more
Right.
likely they're going to be successful, at least in my experience. When people go into meets and they talk about like, I'm going to take my PR, I want 2 shots at it, right? I want to try it on my second. That means they have 2 shots. That's a losing mindset.
Yeah.
It's already going into something with the expectation that you're going to fail once and then fix it the next time. So I've just like, from the perspective of like going into meets, people that are successful with them are, one, they're mentally prepared. They believe they're going to make the lifts they're going to make. They have confidence that the plan is going to go to, be executed properly. So when they show up, they're going to make weight. They're organized. They have all the stuff they need after weigh-ins to reconstitute. They know their warm-ups. They know their warm-up routine. They know exactly the time frames it takes to do those things. They know what attempts they're going to take as far as the warm-ups go. They know what the plan is. So we discuss what numbers are you taking on your first, your second, your third.
Yeah.
If you miss the first, what do we do on the second? If you miss the second, what do we do on the third? They also have a list of priorities. So I like to have people sort of sit down and say, okay, I'm going to do, number 1 priority is making a total.
Mhm.
Number 2 priority is trying to make a PR. Number 3 is trying to win. And that might be different for everybody.
Yeah.
Right. Like we just talked about Europeans, priority number 1 is qualify for the Olympics. So bombing out's not a big deal if I don't have a shot at it.
Right.
So that being said, a plan, understanding the plan, and then having distinct objectives for what you're going to try to accomplish are what generally creates a successful meet and a much more positive experience, because you can look back on that afterward and say, okay, did we do everything according to the plan? Did we do everything that we kind of set ourselves out to do? If we had a plan of like, hey, number 1 goal is to break an American record, and we took 6 attempts that were all well within our abilities and didn't even come close, like, well, we didn't, we said one thing and did another, right? And it never happens, but it's the other way around. But yeah.
Well, I see a lot of that's predicated on your ability to execute. It's almost like, it's like with a program, what are the areas of focus? It's like, well, you want to improve technique, you want to hit certain benchmarks, and it's like, okay, those are the ideals, and then it's like, do we have the skill set to get ourselves there? Kind of with competition coaching, you have to think in the same way of, we want to make PRs, we want to make lifts, we want to qualify for whatever meet. That implies that you can get people there correctly, right? Especially with counting attempts or with managing the athletes themselves, managing the situation. Are there places that coaches generally slip up when they're trying to get someone, say, from showing up to the competition venue to hitting a PR on a competition platform?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest thing that people fuck up is that they don't stick to a plan, right? I mean, how many times have you been at a meet where you watch and it's like you're just watching a train wreck, just like this unfolding of like, person lifts one person misses a first lift, then they're like, fuck it, we'll go up for the second, because they have this like, well, we got to keep moving the number up. I mean, that's like the biggest thing. I think too, like personally, I don't know if you see this, but I see like this explanation of like, I hear this kind of thing said a lot. Oh, I made X number on my second, right? If I make that on my second, like that implies the third is going to be a bigger number, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not, for one, it's not true, but it's also like, if I make, I'm going to go for my PR is 100, I'm going to go for 99 on my first, 102 on my second. If I make 102 on my second, that must mean I'm going to make even more on my third. And it's like, that's just not true.
Yeah.
And you see that all the time. You hear that all the time. People like just believe that each lift is heavier than the last, right? So yeah, I mean, that's like a common thing. That's the most common thing is, I don't know what you see, but I definitely see it's just like people either having no plan or throwing it out the window and just being chaotic and just like chasing the event, chasing the competition, right?
Yeah. No, I would say that's right. And I've helped people in the past who I didn't program for, but I just stepped in, and they're so locked into certain numbers, and it's like you don't look good. I mean,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the way nothing's moving well.
Yeah.
And like you kind of got lucky on that one. It's like, well, if I hit a really big number, I might feel more satisfied with it. It's like I'd feel more satisfied if you just made lifts.
Yeah.
And I think this always comes back to it. I was talking to someone about the qualification procedure and like, how people can kind of best manage that. And ultimately what it comes down to is just making as many attempts as possible. It's like if you can do that and you can pick the right weights to get you as close as possible to that like razor's edge.
Yeah.
Nothing else really does matter because you're limited by your performance and your ability to perform. And I think maybe this is more obvious in powerlifting where it's like hard stops.
Yeah.
It's like you can watch someone pull an attempt or like squat something, and you're like, you just really don't have that much more weight. But in weightlifting, it's every attempt can be a Hail Mary, basically.
Yeah. It can feel like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I think there's
Yeah.
an illusion in weightlifting is that like, because a lift could be a total miss on one attempt and then an easy make on the next, that like, it's like a gambling kind of like random reinforcement. Like, oh, it could happen, right? Like, but the reality is like, does it? Like, what's the probability of that really happening? Like, it's a total outlier, I think, in a lot of cases where, it's the same kind of mentality as like people go into a training day or they're like, oh, well, sometimes I've made PRs when I feel shitty. But that's like such a rare thing. Like generally when you feel like crap, you perform like crap.
Yeah.
Right.
One, how do you triangulate your program in a way where it's like, oh, this one-off thing, how do we recreate it?
Yeah.
It's like, I don't want to create like Haley's Comet.
Yeah.
I want to create, recreate like the thing that's most plain and most obvious and most simple, and we can get there.
Hale-Bopp comment. That's when they all killed themselves. Remember?
I don't remember
that cult. I was just thinking about that. Sorry.
Okay. But yeah, you want to have a program written in a way where it's like, I think this concept of training momentum is like super undersold, but it's like builds momentum, has an obvious pattern of progress, and it can be a delayed or expedited pattern. It's like I've had people where we've had preps and we're always kind of 1 week behind the progression. It's like you'll go up, you'll try and make a lift and you miss. The next week you'll make that weight, but you try to go up, you'll miss. And it's like we're like 1 week behind where we ultimately want to get to. But then you taper and they're fine.
Yeah.
But like having the obvious pattern of progression, having that momentum that's going to carry you into the meet is like that's the writing on the wall that you want.
Here's a question for you. How much do you feel like it's necessary? Because I don't think a lot of people talk about the idea of like this sort of training momentum, which is really just like, I would define it, maybe you define it differently, but as like the prescription of training and the execution of that is right in line with the physical response to training. So that, you are, let's say you plan X amount of lifts in the week and somebody executes all of them with no failures. And that was like right at their abilities. And the next week you do the same. And so there's this consistent, like progressive, you're matching the dose of training to their response very well so that they don't have the perception that they are overextending their abilities to try to accomplish what was prescribed. Right.
Yeah.
And that kind of builds momentum because it feels as though you're moving forward, but you're not running into a wall.
Right.
And like, you don't know how much further you could go, even though it might be like just a tiny bit, you're very well managed in this bubble of like success. Yeah. And so, I mean, like, how much do you, that was my definition of training momentum, how much do you modify what you do to preserve that? Like, is that a priority or is it like, you just hope it works or, going into a
Yeah. I mean, it's critical. I think that whole idea of relying on like a highly fatiguing period of training to then induce like better performance is just, I could see why you would think that
you should feel like shit
before
you
could get really beat down. Right. And it's like, performance should be depressed.
Yeah.
And like, I understand that, but that's really hedging on something that's like a big unknown. But I know if we do the right amount of training and it's like you manage fatigue correctly,
Yeah.
you can see that predictable pattern of performance improvement. And it's like, that's more what I want. So the idea of like overreaches, like unloads and then ramp back up, to me, that sits on a lot of like mechanistic stuff of like, we depress performance, we come under the curve, we recover and then overshoot. I just haven't personally seen that play out very well. I'd much rather see kind of what I think like Mike Teixeira would kind of do, where it's like more stable training and then watching the training play out over time to where you see this obvious trend. And then you can rely on that trend a lot more than trying to kind of like piece together programming that never has like an obvious improvement in it.
I would agree with that. I think that's like the most, I would almost say we should do a like myths, maybe not myths, but like overrated ideas podcast, because that'd be good. Because like, I would say that falls in there.
Yeah.
Like this, okay, we're going into a meet, like you should be the week before the meet, before we deload, you should be so fucked up that like you're in a wheelchair by Friday. And then like when we deload, like you're going to jump up 40 kilos on your snatch, right? And you're telling this to like, a 39-year-old like housewife who's like just gonna do her first meet, right? Yeah. And you're like, we got to overreach. I just feel like that is, I agree. It just doesn't have the intended expectation most times. And you oftentimes just see it, people just get run down and their confidence degrades. They are beat to shit. They deload. They come back from a deload feeling basically the same as they did. Yeah. And they're just in a worse spot because they're not, there's no momentum feeling like, oh, this is like, I'm in a good place.
Well, there's an idea of training efficiency.
Right.
And it's like, okay, so you can do all that and then you can eke out 1 to 3 kilos.
Yeah.
Can you construct training in a way where it's more tolerable, more enjoyable, and still get 1 to 3 kilos?
Yeah.
And it's like, that is much more efficient training.
Yeah.
And I think being wedded to those models that like could make sense if you kind of like think through it and, create graphs and stuff.
Yeah.
But in practice never really pans out. I think that's like a sect of coaching that like people are in.
It's like a sadomasochist thing.
Yeah.
It's like I
have to overreach.
After my athletes leave the gym on Friday night before the meet, I wait in the parking lot and I beat the shit out of them before they get in the car, just to give them that final push over the edge. Like when you deload and that heals up, that broken wrist, when that heals, you're gonna be good. Yeah. So I think that's like a big thing that just creates a lot of problems, is like this, I would say like all the summation of what makes a bad meet, which you kind of talked about, is like having no plan, or having a plan and just throwing out the window as soon as one thing falls apart.
Yeah.
Oh, you missed your opener. Fuck, it's over. Like, it's actually something I've seen a lot of coaches do, which is like the athlete, they go in, they know the plan. Athlete goes in, maybe they miss their first lift, maybe they miss their first squat, or they, something like that in a powerlifting meet. And it's just like, fuck it, you can't do the total.
Yeah.
The rest of this day is a waste of my time, and they abandon them. Or, you miss a snatch and it's like, well, how are we going to get there? We got to jump up now in the second. That's a huge mistake. The leading into the meet, having a ton of like expectation that, hey, if we just go super fucking hard and then deload, it's going to be great. Or having, way too aggressive training and having no momentum, where it's just like 2 steps forward, 1 back, constantly, undermining an athlete's confidence. So they go into the meet having really like no confidence in what they're doing, but also you have no predictability. You don't know like what shape they're in, because you've just been constantly like running them into the ground.
Yeah.
And then the sort of like the super compensation, like, I don't want to call it a hoax, but like it's like it's like an over expectation of what that's going to look like.
Well, and because I use bigger volumes of training at different times, but it's like always with this,
brag about it.
But it's always with this performance improvement, like even during.
Yeah. There's
never someone who's like run down, beat to shit, and they can't hit a certain way.
Yeah.
And if they can't, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's not like oh, we're right where we need to be. Like, we're in the perfect spot. It's like, no, we need to figure this out.
Right.
I'd say to kind of turn this 180 this a little bit. When you think about coaching well at a meet, I think it's being flexible with the athletes that you're coaching as well. Not in the sense of like the actual numerical plan, but it's like how you deal with them more personally,
Yeah.
right? And I
Yeah.
think you can see that same rigidity from certain coaches where it's like, well, this is what, the research says, like, I have to coach like this. And it's like, that's just unrealistic
Mhm.
because so many people require so many different approaches. And it's like, you should kind of be in touch with that.
Yeah.
How do you manage, you say you have 260 athletes at a meet. How do you manage
As I
that?
usually do. Yeah.
Yeah. How would you manage that from a person to person basis?
Copy paste. It's the same thing for everybody. No. So what I would say is like, yeah, if you have a lot of athletes in a session, everything comes down to planning,
Yeah.
right? We've had sessions we coach, not sessions, meets we've coached at. We've had probably 40 or more athletes.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's plenty of coaches that have had more. It doesn't matter if you have a system. Like
Right.
you can't effectively coach 40 people in a meet by yourself.
Yeah.
Like no one is, if you think you can, you're full of shit.
Yeah.
Like you have to imagine like, what are my capabilities and match that to what you're going to do. So when we had 40 people at the meet, like we would have 5 or 6 of us. There's a couple of like people that, are the coaches of those athletes. Then there's people that are there helping. And then there's other athletes that are stepping in after they finish competing to do things like load and get stuff, waters or something, or count or something. So it's just about managing the knowing what you can do and managing it and applying it, because that's going to take you way further than like, I'm Superman, I can coach everybody all at once. To be successful with that number of athletes, a lot of athletes, you have to have more help.
Yeah.
Like this is a given. When you do it though too, it's like, again, the same process. Have priorities. What do we want to do with each person? They write that down. We all look at it and say, this is the plan. Then you have plans, numbers, all these things written down, warm-ups, and you stick to it. And it's a much easier system, to apply. You just go in, what's the lifter going to do? What is their goal? Make adjustments, make calls based on that, and then go from there. Having a lot of athletes and not doing that and trying to wing it is just, you're always going to screw shit up. You're going to mess up somebody's attempt, or, someone's going to, get neglected or whatever it is. Like, you should just have a plan and stick to it. It's not, you're not managing something that's that difficult, right? A meet is a very controlled environment.
Yeah.
So I don't think you need a ton. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's understanding too. You're dealing with people who have their preferences, but when preference should take priority over what's like practical.
Sure. Yeah.
And a lot of those, like, people might give you their warm-ups and it's like, well, I got to take 50 in the back like 8 times.
Yeah.
Like, and I really need
Oh,
to
man.
80 to like 50 to feel good, right?
Yeah.
So I need to take it a line. It's like, you actually don't.
I once helped an athlete who, I don't want to name names, but I once helped an athlete whose coach, when I met the athlete, I was like, so what do you do in your warm-ups? And they were like, well, I wave up. So I go all the way to maximum in the warm-up room. Then I come back down and go back up because I usually do better the second time. And that person bombed out, obviously.
Yeah.
I don't even think I
Bombed out in there.
I didn't
First or
count.
second one.
Yeah. They bombed out the second meet.
Yeah.
I didn't count for them, but because they got someone else who would do this stupid system with them, because I was like, I don't think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
And they didn't lift well. But it's like, that's a level of insanity of like, so you need to do 25 snatches before you actually open, because you need to hit a PR first, then come back and do it again. Preferences make sense if the preferences are logical, or it's like, hey, I just like to take my opener in the back. That's fine. Or I like to do a few extra warm-ups, or I like to do 20 more minutes of mobility.
Well, a good example of this is I was handling Elle at universities, and she likes to take a lift 1 kilo below what she's going to open with in the back.
Right.
It's like, that's super reasonable.
Yeah.
It's a small jump. You go out, you smoke it, you go up, and she crushed it. Right. That's like a really reasonable expectation. I think what I've learned from, being a strength coach for a lot of high schoolers is they have really unreasonable preferences.
Yeah.
And it's like, sometimes you just have to step in and say no.
Yeah.
Like, we're not doing that. And that can be a range of things they want to do, from different movements, different warm-ups, different like nutritional strategies, whatever it is. And sometimes as a coach, you have to understand, what's best.
You want to do some block snatches in your warm-ups before you're open. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to hit a PR block snatch before then. Then I work my way down
go from the floor.
higher blocks to lower blocks to the floor.
Yeah.
Then I'm even do a deficit right before I go out. I just want to get the full range of motion. That does kind of bring me to what I would say is like maybe the sort of like keys to success in a meet.
Yeah.
And I would just define them, more simply as like your competition should mimic the way you train, or sorry, your competition, warm-ups, all those things should mimic how you train.
Yeah.
Like, so, your warm should be typical. You don't do 40, 45, 50, 55, 60 in the gym every day for 6 months and then go to a meet and do, 45, 55, 61, like these weird numbers, right?
Yeah.
Just do the same things. Then I would say, in addition to that, your training should prepare you for the meet. So leading up to the competition, that pre-competition phase, you need to touch singles, and you need to do that on a regular basis. You need to have a sense of like taking reasonable sized jumps. If you take 2 kilo, 3 kilo jumps on the platform, do some of that in training. Like, don't go into training and take 5 kilo jumps or 5% jumps because it's written on the paper. Plan around it to simulate what you're going to do in the competition. It doesn't mean that you're maxing out all the time in the gym, but you should prepare yourself to behave the way you're going to behave in a competition. And then obviously, momentum and all these other things, but like, plan your training like you're competing, in the sense that you do things in a similar fashion, a similar way. Don't take 45 minutes to do a warm-up that should take you 10, right? Do these things that are going to set you up for success. So when you get to the competition, you're in a place where it feels normal. It feels like a workout.
Well, and I think that's where some athletes go wrong, is they lift a certain way in the training hall or in their gym.
Yeah.
And then on a competition platform, they want to lift that exact same way. And sometimes that's unreasonable, right?
Yeah.
So like if you get into meets where it's clustered around certain numbers and that changes the amount of time you have between warm-ups, you have to be flexible. But if you can only go slow, or if you can only go fast, or if you need sometimes that inflexibility is really unhelpful in a competition setting, because as you mentioned, you control the controllables, the weights you take, the number of attempts, but like you can't control the pace of the meet.
Yeah.
I mean, you try to compress it and match it, but sometimes everything slows down a lot.
Right. But you can identify too, before you go to a meet, like if you're like a J session dude in the 81s, like that all 12 of those guys in that session are going to be taking the same number.
Yeah.
So like plan in that way. Like, I'm going to take a 120 snatch or something. Like, there's probably going to be 9 other dudes doing the same thing, and like plan to do warm-ups and be conditioned to move up and down if you have to take extra lifts. Like, you don't want to be in a spot where you're like, oh, I trained with 9-minute rests between attempts. Then I went to a session where everyone had the same number.
Yeah.
And, I was not ready for it.
Yeah.
Or I trained with, 1-minute rest and I couldn't slow down. So it's like, just, understand what you're going to do at the meet. Like, it's pretty typical, pretty obvious in the US what's going to happen. Right.
And I think a question I'd want to ask about recreating kind of a competition-like setting and training. How do you handle misses? Because I think that's where a lot of people really struggle, because you program heavy days and they have a miss or two, and it's like, oh, this is a big problem.
Usually psychological punishment. When someone misses, I like to make sure they're aware of it. I'll post it on Instagram. I'll write a handwritten letter and send it to their relatives and let them know that hey, little Johnny, although he might be your grandson, he's a piece of shit and he missed a 100-kilo snatch 4 times. Just, to really make sure they don't make that same mistake again, right? You can rub their nose in it right away. That way they know not to do it again.
Yeah.
I mean, misses, like, for me, misses are one of those things where, in training, as you're getting close to competition, misses are it's kind of like, what's your tolerance for it? You could train in a way that, like, you have a lot of misses, and that's like par for the course. You have to accept the consequences of that. The more someone misses in training, the more they're probably going to miss in the platform.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that's a stretch to imagine those things are correlated, right? The more of a training session as a percentage of total lifts that becomes misses, the worse that session is.
Yeah.
Right. If you're taking 12 attempts at a lift and you finally make the PR, it's like, that's cool, you made a PR, but like, ultimately that was just like a shitload of bad training all done at once. That being said, there's definitely like a caveat to that, where having sessions that are really hard, that are pushing people to those limits, where there might be some misses, is totally fine.
Yeah.
And like, that should be a part of training, is like, you're going to miss potentially in competition. You're going to have missed lifts.
Yeah.
You can't let that be something where it's like a catastrophic event. So you have to be somewhat, mentally conditioned to doing that. So I would say in training, if somebody's missing a lift, but each miss or each attempt is subsequently better than the last or looks to be better, or they're making an improvement, that to me means they're still in the fight and they're still, potentially could do better. If they start getting worse, you just have to stop.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I think some misses are some of the best ways to learn how
Yeah.
to lift correctly, right?
Yeah.
You get behind the bar a lot, you swing the bar out, you miss it. It's like, okay, you have to make a correction. If you can make it,
What?
or you're just smiling, like
Nothing.
you stay over the bar, like you make it, you make the correction. Now you know how to implement that the next time
Yeah.
as well.
You miss a lot in training.
I knew you were going somewhere.
You
like
miss
that.
a lot in training. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, it helps me press out more lifts.
Uh,
So the weights I do make are more low quality.
yes. Well, when you only do 3x3 snatch once a week, you really hope you get one of those 9 in.
How do misses change based on the training block, right? Because I know we've had a conversation where it's like, okay, maybe you have a specific preparation block. You go heavy every other week instead of every week. And then you have a competition block.
This is going to end poorly.
Yeah,
We're laughing at each other.
Yeah.
Anyways, so okay, I would say the number of misses you're allowed to have in a session, I would prefer that actually be slightly further from a competition.
Yeah.
Because I would say like your general prep phase, all those blocks are going to be light enough that you shouldn't be missing.
Yeah.
Your pre-competition phase, right before meet, you want to be as dialed in as possible. So I would say there should be a limited number of misses allowed, because you just don't want to have a situation where you're just like, maybe you miss 100 kilos 15 times that month. It's like, that's just not a healthy situation to go into. But in that special prep phase where you're training very heavy and you're doing a lot of volume, that's an area where more misses, I would say, would be somewhat tolerable, in the sense that like you might have days where you're feeling incredible, you're overweight, right? You're doing a ton of strength exercises. You're probably in your best shape from the standpoint of like your physical abilities, but your technical skills maybe aren't as honed. Slightly more misses would be okay there. Does that make sense? That's how I would look at it, where it's like, like you're in amazing shape, you're just crushing it, and like, you can take some harder sessions and push these and maybe a few more misses. As we get closer to competition, we don't want that situation. We want you to be like only successes if possible.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a mistake I made in the past, of that like block before you start to peak is not going heavy enough. We're not taking advantage of feeling good. And I think kind of that same idea with the overreach. It's like that idea that on competition day it's going to be there. And not never kind of pushing to see actually where you're at.
Yeah.
Or if, I think Mike Tashir said this and it kind of resonated with me. It's like
the Mike Tashir podcast.
We should get him
2 times in one podcast, Josh.
But he talks about getting into peak shape consistently. It's like the more peaks you can reach, ultimately, the better you're going to be, right? So it's like,
well, by definition, the more peaks you're at, you're in a plateau. If you're just at a peak for an extended period of time, it's just a plateau.
Right.
It's flat.
Right. So if you can continually reach a different peak condition, so you kind of you train, you make progress, you reset the training block, you train, you make more progress, and those numbers continually climb. You get more exposure to heavier and heavier weights, right? And I think in weightlifting, it's like you're so reliant on everything under 100%. It's like you're almost scared to increase the max.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, we'll wait until a testing day to bump those numbers up, instead of reaching that peak condition prematurely, changing the numbers, right? Changing the expectation, and then reassessing or readjusting training.
Do you feel like you, in preparing people for meets, that you, like on what side of the spectrum, where like one side is like way too many heavy sessions, the other side would be like, oh, we're going to save it for the max out day once in a training cycle? Do you feel like you've been on one side or the other, or where you're at now, or has that changed?
Yeah, I tend to err on the side of being a little more cautious, because I just tend to prescribe most lifts.
Right.
And that works if people know how to train, because they're like, hey, I felt good, took it up, took a lot of cracks at a PR or made a PR. For the people who are very conservative, it can be a little rough because they're just not getting exposure to lifts that could be beneficial. But again, then, some people benefit from the really, really high quality training. Versus when it's open, it can get ragged pretty fast.
Yeah.
So I think, a lot of a system is dependent on the athlete within it.
Right.
It's like, I see that we have up to 90% prescribed, but I know if I feel good, I'll take it up.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like, I'd love to make more lifts at 90%, make them correctly or make them well. And those are two different approaches, but they can both be beneficial depending on who's
Right.
executing them. So I'd say I tend to err a little lighter and probably on the side of having the athlete
Yeah.
adjust and take it up if they feel good.
Yeah.
I don't know where you sit with that.
No, I would agree, probably closer to that. Like I used to, I mean, I've been at different points. I mean, obviously, when I was lifting, it was like I would miss squats twice, 3 times
Yeah.
and try them again. And that's like, you're not making it the second time. I don't know why you're trying it a third. But then all the way to the other side where it's like just being way too submaximal and not ever touching heavy weights and realizing like I did not prepare this person to lift a heavy weight. I would say where I'm at, in contemporary, the current meta would be like, a lot more heavy singles incorporated into the training program itself, both weightlifting and powerlifting, from the perspective that, heavy singles are a heavier singles than the work sets, or heavy singles, not maximum, but like, these RPE 7-8 singles, where it's like, it's a great way to give exposure to the athlete to a higher intensity, but also give us some feedback on how their shape is, give us some confidence as far as like, oh, I've touched heavier lifts more regularly. So you're kind of always ready for ramping that up. If you train at 75, 85, 90, 80%, 75, 80, 85%, like, and you never touch anything over 90, suddenly this 90% number almost has this like mystique to it, which is like, it's not special. It's just a number, it's just a percentage. But people get stuck with it because it's like, oh, that's heavy. And then like they do a 90% single at the end of the training cycle and it looks like shit. And you're like, man, this person, I did not get them in shape for heavy weights.
How do you manage any potential fatigue from having more heavier exposures? Do you feel like it is incredibly fatiguing?
I don't. I think it's a matter of the athlete understanding when to terminate it.
Right.
In weightlifting, it's like a few heavier snatches is not going to be that fatiguing, right? Heavier clean and jerks once or twice. I probably wouldn't have it more than maybe once a week in some phases, just because it's like, you don't need to be constantly touching it. You just need to stay in touch with those numbers. So to manage fatigue, I would just reduce a little bit of the total volume in that session. If we were going to do 12 or 15 reps, do 9, right? So you kind of replace a set with some heavier singles. So total volume is probably fairly equated, in weightlifting. But it's like, I think as long as people understand what that means, powerlifting is a little harder. People in powerlifting, they get numbers in their head. So it's like, oh, an RPE 7 single equals this. It's like, no. Who knows what it is?
Yeah.
Figure it out that day and just touch the number that moves the right way. So that's a little harder. Especially with people that are like really fixated on numbers. They're going to qualify for nationals or something. They get trapped in this place where like, I got to pull this weight or I got to squat this number. And so they just think of it as like RPE 7 equals this. So next week, RPE 8 must be 10 kilos more. And that's harder to manage. You just have to teach them.
Yeah. And I've been in that place where we'll do, not RMs necessarily, but heavier sets of say 3 or 4, 2. And it's also like being convinced that like a rep max PR isn't the thing we're chasing.
Yeah.
Right. We're just chasing load on the bar and then driving that up over time. So it's like being able to use that as a stimulus for improvement. That's the more important thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Not like peaking your 3R.
Yeah.
4RM.
It's a very similar thing to, it's very similar in my opinion to the idea of like we talked about in the beginning of like attempt 1, attempt 2, attempt 3, they have to be heavier. And like that, like doing a number on your second is what makes your third bigger. It's just not, that's not true. Right.
Yeah.
The same idea is true in training, is that adaptation has to precede the overload.
Right.
Like overload is the idea of matching the stimulus given to somebody to their abilities, right? Or to be slightly above their abilities. So it's like, you're going to do a squat today. Like, how much do you need to squat to get stronger?
Right.
Well, it's based on what you've done in the past. Right. And so we have to remember that, like, building training momentum, being successful with things is about like applying the right training stimulus, then seeing the result the next time, right? Then applying the right stimulus based on the results.
Yeah. That's probably why longer training blocks would make more sense, is to have that pin out.
Right.
So if you start at week 1 and by week 4, you've kind of adapted to training, you're able to put the correct weight on the bar, which might be a PR.
Yeah.
But if you try to like pigeonhole that in early, you create a lot of fatigue because you're going to get out of position. It's going to be really ragged.
Yeah.
Versus kind of letting it happen more gradually, right?
Yeah. Having it be more of an emergent thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Makes more sense.
We did a great podcast with Eric Helms. And
Most of our podcasts are great.
They are fantastic.
The ones I'm on are.
Yeah, we'll let the audience decide.
Yeah.
But we did, and he talks about like how
exactly.
actually sports science research and the literature kind of at large is a little behind these ideas of like having training be the tests, having it be more of an emergent phenomenon versus like trying to be proactive and say like we need to provide an incredibly large stimulus that we eventually adapt to and improve performance. Like I don't know, how about we do good training and see what happens?
I mean, that's like largely like the entirety of my, I would say, like thesis behind like a lot of what has changed in my opinion is like when I first started lifting, it was just like, oh, like programs and things, like you just do this magical combination of sets and reps and that like tricks your body into being stronger, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of coaches that probably start in that place. They don't understand what's going on. But yeah, it's like very much, it's like programs are a poor manifestation of what good training is.
Mhm.
Programs are a proxy for what we expect to happen. So it's an assumption. You write, hey, week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. That's a belief that something's going to happen, but it's not the actual thing.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's a place where I think that's obviously a discussion for another podcast, but
yeah,
it definitely is like, it's not that. It is, we want to look at, applying stress and then we grow from there.
Right. I think coaches become married to tools, right? So it's like, oh, an RM is a great
My
tool.
wife's married to a tool.
Okay. Cut that. No, but like, it's like, okay, we're going to use RMs because it prescribes an absolutely higher intensity than like typical training. So it's like everything in the program's an RM.
Yeah.
And it's like suddenly we just have a program that's like, I mean, it's so laden with just like one specific way of approaching training.
Yeah.
And it's like a program can look a lot of different ways just based on what the requirement is. And that's going to change based on the shape of the athlete, right? So it's hard to lean into, say, a very specific set rep combination or RMs or drop sets or whatever.
Right.
Because, I mean, even
they don't really matter.
No, they don't matter, right? It's a type of training stress in a very specific period of time.
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Exactly. Cool. Should we answer some questions from the chat?
Yeah. See, there are a few.
Are there any? Let's see. What do we have? Brian W. Don't know if this has been brought up, but should we plug in our readiness score before we start any type of warm-up stretching or other? Yeah, I mean, I would do your warm-up and stretching before you actually enter a readiness. I think get in the gym, move around a bit, because you could, maybe you're coming in from the cold or whatever, and like it might be like a little bit influenced by the way you feel just right there. So I'd say do your readiness or do your warm-ups, do your mobility, whatever, kind of maybe even touch the bar for a minute and see how you feel. Then, enter a score in. That's what I would do.
If you had a crude guess, what do you think is the percentage where most people are going to feel out about what they're capable of on a given day?
I mean, it depends. I think the better you feel, the lower the weight's going to be.
Okay.
Like when I would go in the gym, sometimes I'd touch the bar and exactly when I said that, you know what that is, right? You grab the bar and like, oh, I feel amazing right now. I think if you feel like shit, it could be that like maybe you start warming up and you don't notice it until it's a little bit heavier, right? Or you could feel really good with light weights and then you get to like a work set, it just starts to feel way sluggish and not good. So, I would say it's like the readiness thing is more a matter of like tracking a trend. If you constantly notice that your readiness fluctuates a lot, or that it's continually dropping, or it's continually high when it probably shouldn't be, then the training may be like misdosed for you, right? Too little, too much.
Yeah. And I think that's smart. And I think it's also like, if you were to profile athletes, which you can't really do, but it's like you constantly have a low readiness score, a high readiness score, but performance doesn't necessarily correlate.
Yes.
That just tells you kind of how you perceive training.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. It could be, if you're like a very sort of negative person or like a really positive, like you might, readiness is not necessarily an indicator. It's not necessarily a readiness survey is different than tracking like
Yeah.
the physical metrics that would
Yeah.
imply what your fatigue levels are.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not exact.
Cool. Rack 979. Any question? Yes. Will Lasha hit a 500 kilo total? This is a good question.
Is it?
The answer is no. He's not going to hit a 500 kilo total, and I'll tell you why. Because there's no opportunity between now and when he retires that he would have a chance.
Yeah.
There was one situation in which he had a shot to make the 500 total.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, that would be is if the World Championships after the Olympics was in Georgia
Yeah.
or the Euros was in Georgia, because he would have one more reason to do another meet, and he might do it there.
But do you think he's actually in physical shape or could be in physical shape?
I think he's done a 500 total.
Yeah.
In training.
Yeah.
That'd be my guess. I think he's done 230, 270.
Do you think currently he could get into
No.
that shape?
I don't see him being in that shape.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope I'm wrong. Like, I hope that we come back to this and like, yeah, he did a 500 at the Olympics, but it's just like no one's pushing him enough. Gore pushes him in the snatch, but Gore and Lalion can't clean a jerk to stay with him. All he needs to do is win the Olympics to be a 3-time gold, and that's way bigger deal than the 500 total.
Yeah.
I just don't see there being an opportunity for it.
Yeah. And when was the last time he hit a world record? It was like 2021.
Yeah.
It feels a while ago.
Yeah,
That
I mean,
was
that
kind
was
of like
it.
in peak shape.
And that was after the Olympics, right?
Yeah.
So he came back, he had one more quad, he did one meet. It would have happened in Tashkent. It was going to happen. It was 7 kilos away.
Yeah.
492. I mean, that's so big.
That's huge.
That's such a big
And
number.
he did 225, 270 in training. Do you think he snatched more than that?
I think he's probably snatched 230 in
Yeah.
training. Yeah. And maybe he's done. Yeah. That's my guess. I mean, yeah. Like people say they've seen him snatch 230 off blocks. So like you can basically assume he's probably done a 500 total. But yeah, training doesn't mean shit.
Yeah.
You know, as much as people on the internet and on Instagram love to talk about, this is one of my pet peeves is like the comparison of, I'm just rambling.
I know you leaned back as you started this.
The comparison of like, oh, a guy did this in training and then he could have been this against some other guy in the competition. It's like, they're just two different places. Brian W. again, should athletes then always expect a PR every meet they do or get close or get as close as possible? Depends. You should expect to perform to the abilities of your training at a meet. That's the expectation. If your training has driven you to the point where you're making progress, yeah, a PR is something to expect. A meet is not a special situation in that it is like meets, imbue you with some magical powers. It's just, you're going to a meet and you're expressing what you trained, and what you trained should be something you're pretty aware of. Like you did some singles, you touch heavier weights, like you're going into the competition knowing like, okay, I'm pretty good at this. Like I know where about I'm at. I'm going to shoot for this number. If you're pretty new to lifting, like, yeah, you might be making PRs at a lot of meets, right? As you get more advanced, it's going to be, slightly less frequent for sure.
I think for most people, they generally see a tick in performance when they compete.
Oh,
and a lot of that is like also you're doing more specific training.
It's exciting too, right?
It's really exciting. You're managing fatigue. You're trying to be as ready as possible on the day. You're doing everything you can for the best performance. And in training, it's not that you don't do that. It's just that you don't focus as much attention and energy on doing that. So I generally will tell people, it's like, sign up for a competition. If you really want to see where you're at, that's when you're going to do it. You're not going to do it in, your local gym when it's like 8 p.m. You just got off work, because it's just that everything isn't aligned in a way to get you to peak performance.
Yeah. I think you want to train to be at the best shape you can be in a meet. I mean, the goal is to train to peak for competition.
Yeah.
So the expectation is that you've done those things to get you there, but just the assumption that I'm going to a meet, I'm going to get a PR should, don't think that way, because you may go to a meet and you don't even need a PR, right?
Yeah.
You may go to a meet and whatever. It's like, that's not the way it always pans out.
And if you have that mindset, you might go 2 for 6, kind of as we mentioned at the start of this, right?
Yeah. There's just too much like holding on to like the outcome versus focusing on what you can do that day.
Right.
That's all the questions. So Josh, what do we do in the next few weeks, months? Who do we have?
Yeah. And the cool thing is we actually came up with this idea with Chris Tabor is to do kind of a research debrief. So basically, we're going to take papers that are recently published in strength sports, the sports science world, and we're going to debrief over those. We'll probably look at, what they attempted to answer, what questions they were trying to generate, the methods they used to test those, the results, and then kind of the discussion. And the discussion really is just like the practical application of it. Like, where does this fit into the larger body of what we know as researchers and coaches? So Chris will come on. We'll do that towards the end of the month. Then we have our expert speaker next week, which is Jake Rimmer, who is basically doing a dissertation on hypertrophy.
Nice.
And then we have Kyle Travis the following month, who is looking more at maximal strength and tapering and peaking. I kind of like to create that sequence where it's just looking at all these training topics kind of in a way that makes sense, almost from a process standpoint. And then embedding that research component now every single month will be huge. And then we'll have some time for us to do Q&As and more of an open dialogue.
That's cool. Yeah, it's gonna be exciting. I'm looking forward to it. Obviously, this is, we're starting slow. We're going to grow and build out this big coaching mentorship program.
Yeah.
I think what we'll start doing is bringing in as well a little bit more structure to maybe some of the more basic concepts for people, like, how to prepare somebody, meet preparation, these kind of things. At some point, once the new website is in existence, we'll have a blog. So you'll have a bunch of articles there.
I just edited an article from Chris on sleep and ways to manage that, like reasons behind trying to get the best quality sleep possible. So he's pumping out a lot of content. So that's all going to be pushed to that.
Just generates.
It's like that's all he does.
Spews out writing.
It's not very good, but
no, it's all trash, but he does a lot of it, which is good. So it makes up, right? So mostly garbage, but there's a lot. So there's that. Yeah. So we have the websites coming soon. The blog will be there. The research review is going to be a cool segment now. We'll probably, as we continue doing this, start to grow into more frequent kind of things. So podcasts, articles, the mentorship, Q&As, courses eventually for sure. And then very exciting is probably in the next couple weeks, we will have some testers using the coaching platform. We're still, ironing out and building things. We never stop building things. We just keep throwing more features in. But very cool, very exciting. I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be really cool. I'm excited to see where this ends up in 6 months.
Yeah.
I think that, starting where we're at now, but like building out more and more stuff and getting you and Chris kind of on board as far as like really cranking out some of that stuff is going to be cool.
Yeah. It's going to be great.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. I am as well.
You want to take us out?
I'd love to. Thanks, guys, for tuning into this month's Free Friday, which is this week's Friday conversation between Max, Ada, and I.
Yeah.
We talked all about competition coaching, the do's, the don'ts, and a lot of training talk related to that. Also, your experiences from Europeans. If you guys enjoyed it, tell a friend, tell many friends, tell everybody. Again, we desperately need as many people on here as possible. And we will catch you all next week with Jake Rimmer.